As we approach 1776, I'd like to pause for a moment and take a consideration of what kind of government might exist in a new country. This was actually a complex idea at the time. There were several governments that were available to Europeans. France and Spain, for example, had monarchies. That was very common. It was well understood. A king or a royal family that ran the country. Britain had what was called a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the monarchy was kept in check to some extent by a constitution which permitted a parliament. Americans had these sort of choices right out of the gate, but they also understood about ancient Greek and Roman culture, democracies and republics. Different people had different ideas at that time about what kind of government America should have. How would you unite everybody about a common government? In 1776, a pamphlet took America by storm. The pamphlet was entitled Common Sense, and it meant basically the same thing it means today. Some kind of argument that is so simple, so self-evident, that everybody can agree. The issue under question in Common Sense was complex. What kind of government should we have? Out of all the kinds of government that are available, which kind should we have? Now, Thomas Paine is the author of Common Sense, and he wrote it in 1775, published it in early 1776, and it took the colonies by storm. Literally, hundreds of thousands of copies were produced, and not only in North America, also in France and also in London. It was a sensation. It was like the Harry Potter of 1776. People everywhere began reading it, and he had written it in such a way that even people who were not particularly well educated could understand his argument. All across North America, in the pubs, in the coffee houses, and just among family members, people would buy the pamphlet and talk about it. And he made some very clear arguments. Most people today call him the father of the American Revolution. The argument is, if he had not written Common Sense, if it had not caught America's attention at such an important moment, Americans may not have unified behind a particular government. Before Common Sense, it was somewhat treasonous to talk about independence, or it was at least uncouth, the kind of thing only certain people did. But after Common Sense, everyone talked about independence, and not just the Congress in Philadelphia. What does it say? Well, it starts off by talking about Boston, and I'd like to share a little quote about Boston. Paine said this: "It is good fortune of many of us to be distant from the scene of present sorrow, the evil not sufficiently brought to their doors to make them feel the precariousness with which all American property is possessed. But let our imagination transport us a few moments to Boston. That seat of wretchedness will teach us wisdom and instruct us forever to renounce a power in whom we can have no trust." So he started off by asking people to remember what was happening in Boston. But that's not where he stopped. He went on to consider some other major themes about government. The first one had to do with the king. Why should we trust a king? The king and the peers of the king are tyrannical and antithetical to republicanism. They're not elected. They do not contribute to the people, he said. They're also diabolical. The first kingdom in the Old Testament was an aberration against the rulership of God. So he even used scripture, which many Americans appreciated. He also made this argument: just because you're a good leader and a good king, it does not follow that your child will be a good king or that your grandchild will be a good king. We don't even know who those people are. Why should I say that you can rule me, and furthermore, your children can rule my children, and your grandchildren can rule my grandchildren? That doesn't make sense. The monarchy, he said, was actually responsible for almost every problem in the North American colonies, that all men were born equal. that the difference between kings and subjects was false. That's the kind of argument that Americans understood. And so, by quickly writing this pamphlet, he had removed monarchy as an option. He had removed constitutional monarchy as an option. And in fact, independence became the best possible action for the colonies. They should draft a new continental charter, a constitution. All the colonies should have representatives in a Republican Congress that was decided by popular elections regardless of property, race, or creed. So he was suggesting a democracy that was similar to that in ancient Greece. This was a radical democracy. He was saying everyone should get to vote. Congress would eventually say almost everyone should get to vote. The result was profound. Pennsylvania produced a new state constitution in 1776, and it followed many of the suggestions by Paine, including this radical democracy. The U.S. Constitution would include elements popularized by Paine as well. And of course, the Declaration of Independence had some themes from Paine. Washington was so taken by the arguments that even while his men surrounded Boston, he had it read to them. And he said that most of his men found it extremely thought-provoking. Commoners rallied to the cause of American independence, and they began talking about being Americans, not British citizens, a different kind of citizen. It was also very popular in France, as I mentioned, and it would later resurge 20 years later during the French Revolution. And Congress, which had offered the olive branch petition in an attempt to stave off the conflict, now saw that there was only one way forward: independence. And in fact, a proper Declaration of Independence would be needed. My main point in this lesson has been to show that there came, at a very specific time, a pamphlet that unified all of America. That pamphlet, Common Sense, allowed Americans to begin talking about independence, allowed Americans to begin talking about what kind of government they needed. And it actually had an enormous impact, not just in America, but also across the globe.